The history of the Second World War is written in official reports, in triumphal speeches, and in black and white photographs of victory. But beneath the surface lies a shadow archive, a hidden ledger of decisions, betrayals, and atrocities that were deliberately buried. These are not stories told in classrooms or commemorated in monuments. They are the fragments pried from sealed cabinets, fragments smeared with redactions and warnings stamped top secret. They reveal not the heroism of nations, but the cost of survival, the weight of compromise, and the depth of cruelty hidden behind official lies. For decades, governments denied them, rewriting memory to protect fragile alliances and emerging Cold War strategies. The documents whisper of secret pacts in dimly lit war rooms, of massacres carried out in silence, of scientists spared in exchange for their knowledge of suffering. Each discovery feels like trespassing on forbidden ground, peeling back layers of history meant never to be seen. These are not myths, but carefully erased chapters. Tonight, we unseal 4 of those forbidden files, 4 secrets from World War II that history tried, and in many cases succeeded, to forget. Chapter 1. Classified tunnels beneath Berlin's ruins. In April 1945, Berlin was a dying city. The once proud capital of the Reich had become a skeletal ruin, smothered in ash and rubble. Soviet artillery pounded day and night, reducing entire neighborhoods to dust, while German civilians scurried through shadows, desperate for food, desperate for water, desperate for survival. Above ground, the world saw only destruction, but beneath those shattered streets, a darker story was unfolding. One sealed away in documents marked with the codename Action Feuerzauber. The tunnels were not mere bomb shelters. They stretched for miles, linking ministries, bunkers, and railway hubs in a labyrinth designed not just for defense, but for concealment. Reports recovered in 1947 from Soviet archives describe hidden chambers reinforced with steel and concrete, some large enough to house entire convoys of trucks. These tunnels, according to NKVD engineer Pavel Sudoplatov, were discovered during the Red Army's push into the government district. Yet as quickly as Soviet troops documented them, entrances were ordered sealed with explosives. The reason? Crates, stacked and numbered, marked with symbols unfamiliar even to seasoned intelligence officers, had already disappeared. Unconfirmed testimonies from captured SS engineers suggest that the tunnels were used in the final days not to shield Hitler, as post-war legends insisted, but to evacuate personnel and materials of scientific importance. Witnesses reported convoys moving underground toward Tempelhof and Tiergarten, escorted by Waffen-SS men bearing insignia linked to the Ahnenerbe, the Reich's arcane research bureau. What they carried remains unknown, though Allied cables later hinted at experimental nerve agents and prototypes of the V-weapon series, possibly incomplete models of jet propulsion systems and chemical dispersal units. What lends weight to these accounts is the strange silence that followed. When American OSS units arrived in Berlin, fragments of Soviet field reports made their way into G2 intelligence summaries. One memorandum dated July 12, 1945, warned of unaccounted for German scientific assets believed exfiltrated via subterranean infrastructure. Yet the memorandum was never circulated beyond a handful of senior officers. Instead, Operation Paperclip shifted into full gear, bringing scores of German scientists westward under new identities. The timing was too precise to ignore. For the Soviets, the tunnels became an obsession. Engineers attempted to reopen sections in the summer of 1946. But documents suggest that key passageways were deliberately flooded or collapsed before they could be fully explored. Survivors claim to have seen Soviet labor battalions enter the ruins only to vanish without explanation. Decades later, in the 1960s, East German construction workers stumbled upon sealed shafts while expanding subway lines. Their discovery was quickly classified by the Stasi, the entrances welded shut, the maps confiscated. In the West, silence was no less deliberate. British intelligence files declassified in the late 1990s reveal a chilling note. An MI6 officer, reviewing Berlin tunnel reports in 1948, scribbled a single sentence. Too sensitive to pursue. Both sides complicit. The line suggests not just Soviet awareness, but Anglo-American collaboration in concealing what had been extracted from beneath Berlin. That collaboration, born in the ashes of the city, became part of the shadow diplomacy of the early Cold War. Some historians argue the tunnels contained looted art, perhaps the missing panels of the Amber Room, or archives stolen from across occupied Europe. Others insist the prize was scientific data, chemical formulas, blueprints, and research notes beyond the reach of the bombed-out laboratories above ground. What little evidence survives is buried in conflicting testimony. A 1952 CIA memorandum, heavily redacted, references Feuerzauber files and warns against disclosure, citing potential destabilization of public trust in post-war alliances. Berliners themselves spoke of vibrations at night, long after the war, when entire sections of pavement caved into hollow spaces below. Children whispered of echoing footsteps under streets that should have been silent. Yet no official excavation was ever undertaken in the western sectors. The city rebuilt itself over the bones of the labyrinth, burying its secrets under asphalt and concrete. Even today, archival maps confirm the existence of anomalous underground structures inconsistent with civilian construction. They align with grid patterns traced in captured Wehrmacht engineering documents, but their purpose and their contents remain matters of speculation. Were the tunnels simply escape routes for desperate officers, or were they arteries through which the Reich smuggled away its final and most dangerous secrets? The truth lies somewhere between rubble and silence. What can be said with certainty is this: both the Soviets and the Western Allies knew more than they admitted. They chose not to tell the public, not because the tunnels were irrelevant, but because what was hidden beneath Berlin threatened the fragile order that emerged after 1945. To acknowledge the truth would be to admit that the war did not end with surrender, that in the shadows, it bled quietly into the Cold War. Berlin's ruins have long since been rebuilt, its scars covered by glass towers and neon lights. But beneath the city, in sealed concrete chambers where the air has not been disturbed for 80 years, the echoes of Action Feuerzauber remain. The tunnels, like the war itself, refuse to die. They linger as silent monuments to a secret that both victors and vanquished tried to erase. A secret that waits in darkness, beyond the reach of official history. Chapter 2. Forbidden Pact of Operation. Keelhaul. The end of World War II is remembered in images of liberated cities, soldiers embracing in the streets, and leaders signing documents that promised peace. But hidden behind these celebrations was a decision so grim, so morally corrosive, that governments involved spent decades burying every trace. It was known as Operation Keelhaul. Between 1944 and 1947, tens of thousands of Soviet citizens, soldiers, defectors, and civilians who had fled west to escape Stalin's grip were forcibly handed back to the Soviet Union by their supposed Allied protectors. What happened to them after their return is one of the darkest secrets of the post-war settlement. The name Keelhaul was chosen by the British, drawn from an archaic naval punishment in which sailors were dragged beneath the hull of a ship until their bodies tore against the barnacles. The metaphor was not accidental. The operation was punishment disguised as repatriation. These men and women had fought against Stalin, some alongside the Wehrmacht, others merely trying to survive the brutal choices imposed by total war. They believed surrendering to the British or Americans would mean freedom. Instead, they were betrayed, bound in silence by treaties signed in smoke-filled war rooms. The Yalta Conference of February 1945 was the origin point. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin gathered on the Crimean coast to plan the shape of Europe after victory. Among the agreements, hidden beneath larger discussions of borders and occupation zones, was a commitment. All Soviet citizens found in Allied territory would be returned to the USSR, regardless of their wishes. For Churchill, who had pressed Stalin for assurances that British prisoners of war would be freed, the deal was framed as reciprocal. For Roosevelt, anxious to secure Soviet entry into the war against Japan, it was a price he was willing to pay. For Stalin, it was an opportunity to exact revenge on those he considered traitors. The human cost began almost immediately. In Austria, British forces rounded up Cossack units who had surrendered near Lienz in May 1945. These were not German officers, but men who had fought against Bolshevik rule for decades, many with their wives and children in tow. Documents in the UK National Archives describe how British officers assured them they were being transferred to camps for processing. Instead, they were loaded onto trains and trucks, escorted under guard, and delivered across the border into Soviet hands. Eyewitness reports detail the screams of women clinging to their children as they realized their fate. Some chose suicide, hurling themselves into rivers rather than face Stalin's firing squads. The United States played its role as well. In Bavaria and Italy, American military police conducted similar roundups. Declassified State Department cables from 1946 reveal internal protests from junior officers who saw the consequences. One, a captain stationed near Munich, wrote, "We are delivering these people to their deaths. This is not repatriation. It is extermination under another name." His letter never reached the public. It was buried in archives, stamped confidential, and ignored in the rush to stabilize occupied Europe. What awaited those sent east was no mystery. Soviet Order No. 270, signed by Stalin in August 1941, had declared all Red Army soldiers who surrendered to the enemy as traitors. By that logic, every prisoner who had survived German camps or chosen to fight against Moscow's forces was guilty of treason. NKVD records released decades later confirm what Allied officers already suspected: mass executions at border crossings, followed by transportation of survivors to the Gulag system. Camps in Vorkuta, Norilsk, and Kolyma swelled with new arrivals. Broken men and women condemned not for their crimes, but for their survival. The numbers remain contested. Some historians estimate 1.5 to 2 million individuals were affected by forced repatriations across Europe. Others place the figure lower, around 500,000. The truth is difficult to determine, not least because both Soviet and Allied records were systematically destroyed or falsified. Yet the testimonies that survived paint a consistent and damning picture. At Lienz, British guards recalled handing over 40,000 Cossacks in a single week. In Italy, entire camps of prisoners were loaded onto trains without explanation, the doors chained shut. Those who resisted were beaten unconscious, their bodies dragged aboard. The operation sparked outrage among some Allied officers. General Alexander Patch of the US 7th Army allegedly resisted repatriating groups in his custody, delaying transfers until ordered directly by higher command. In Britain, Lord Aldington, who oversaw logistics in Austria, later faced lawsuits decades after the war when survivors accused him of complicity in mass murder. Though courts shielded him under claims of official duty, the accusations never fully faded. In every case, the defense was the same. The orders came from above, sealed by agreements none dared challenge. What makes Operation Keelhaul especially disturbing is the secrecy that followed. For years, official histories omitted any mention of forced repatriations. The term repatriation itself was carefully chosen to suggest mercy rather than betrayal. When survivors tried to speak out, they were dismissed as liars or dismissed as tainted collaborators. It was not until the 1970s, when suppressed British and American files began to surface, that the scale of the operation became undeniable. By then, most of the victims were long dead. The moral stain of Operation Keelhaul lies not only in the deaths it caused, but in the deliberate erasure of memory. Allied governments, victorious and celebrated, could not admit to having condemned their own allies in arms to Stalin's terror. They chose silence, allowing families to wonder for decades what had become of their loved ones. The truth was filed away in cabinets stamped with red warnings, hidden until public outrage had dulled and the Cold War had rewritten the world's priorities. Today, the word Keelhaul rarely appears in textbooks or memorial speeches. It lingers in specialized archives, in whispered survivor accounts, in the footnotes of history that no one teaches. Yet for those who endured the betrayal, it was a wound that never healed. To understand World War II in its entirety is to face not only the victories but the compromises that corrupted them. Operation Keelhaul remains one of the most chilling reminders that the cost of peace was often paid in silence, in betrayal, and in blood. Chapter 3. Erased Experiments of Unit 731. In the northern reaches of Manchuria, hidden behind the barbed wire and snow-swept plains, the Japanese Imperial Army operated a facility that even today remains a synonym for cruelty. Officially, it was known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. In reality, it was Unit 731, a sprawling complex near Harbin dedicated not to medicine, but to the systematic weaponization of disease and human suffering. From 1936 until Japan's defeat in 1945, thousands of prisoners, Chinese civilians, Soviet captives, Korean resistance fighters, and Allied POWs were subjected to experiments that defied comprehension. They were dissected without anesthesia, injected with plague cultures, exposed to frostbite until their limbs shattered, and forced into pressure chambers until their lungs collapsed. What the world was not told, and what remained buried in classified vaults for decades, was that the men responsible for these crimes did not face justice. They were protected, shielded, and recruited, their knowledge purchased in secret by the very powers that would later condemn Japan's militarism. Unit 731 operated under the command of General Shiro Ishii, a physician-turned-general whose charisma and brutality earned him absolute control. His mission was clear: to perfect biological warfare for the Emperor's armies. By the early 1940s, the unit had developed plague bombs, ceramic devices designed to shatter mid-air and release infected fleas over enemy territory. Reports confirm their use during campaigns in China, where outbreaks of bubonic plague followed Japanese air raids. Entire villages were decimated, their deaths attributed to natural epidemics. These atrocities were known to Chinese survivors and Soviet intelligence, but to the outside world, they remained invisible until much later. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Soviet troops advancing through Manchuria captured remnants of the unit and seized volumes of documentation. The Tokyo trials, convened by the Allies to prosecute Japanese war crimes, made passing reference to atrocities in Manchuria. But strangely, the tribunal never pursued charges against Ishii or his senior staff. Witnesses who attempted to testify about biological warfare were silenced, their statements excluded from the record. Why? The answer lies in the newly declassified files of the US Army's Chemical Corps and the intelligence wing of General Douglas MacArthur's Occupation Administration. Beginning in late 1945, American officers recognized the potential value of the research gathered at Unit 731. Diseases weaponized, dispersal methods perfected, and resistance studies catalogued. All the information represented years of data the United States lacked. The Cold War was already taking shape, and Washington feared Soviet advances in biological warfare. A deal was struck in secret. General Ishii and his top scientists were granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for their cooperation. Instead of standing in a courtroom as war criminals, they sat in offices, compiling reports for US military intelligence. Testimony preserved in Fort Detrick archives confirms shipments of preserved samples, labeled serums or antigens, arriving from Japan for analysis. These included plague cultures, anthrax strains, and frostbite survival notes. The Soviets, aware of the betrayal, staged their own war crimes trial in Khabarovsk in 1949. There, captured Unit 731 personnel were publicly tried and sentenced. Yet in the West, the trials were dismissed as propaganda. American newspapers carried almost no mention of them, and Western historians for decades treated them as Soviet fabrications. Only after the end of the Cold War, when both US and Russian documents began to surface, did the extent of Unit 731's protection become undeniable. The truth was not propaganda, it was complicity. What makes this erasure particularly chilling is the fate of the victims. Thousands perished in Harbin's frozen laboratories, their bodies cremated, their identities erased. No memorial was erected for them until decades later, and even then, the names of most remain unknown. Survivors who attempted to tell their stories were silenced by post-war censorship. Chinese and Korean voices were ignored in the rush to rebuild Japan as an ally against communism. For families seeking closure, there was none. Their loved ones disappeared into smoke, their suffering denied by the same nations that proclaimed themselves defenders of justice. The secrecy extended into research institutions. In the 1950s, American military laboratories conducted frostbite experiments eerily similar to those described in Ishii's reports. Patterns of test design, subject exposure, and tissue analysis mirror those performed at Harbin. The knowledge transfer was undeniable, yet never acknowledged publicly. Scientific papers cited unpublished Japanese data, a vague euphemism concealing its true, horrific origin. The victims of Unit 731 thus became unwilling contributors to advancements in medicine and warfare, their pain fueling progress that bore no memory of their names. For Japan, the aftermath was one of silence and denial. Ishii himself lived quietly, reportedly advising US biological programs in the 1950s before dying of throat cancer in 1959. Many of his colleagues re-entered civilian life, some taking prestigious academic posts. They wrote textbooks, lectured medical students, and lived as respected professionals. The crimes they committed, shielded by international deals, were almost entirely erased from Japanese education. When survivors attempted to sue the Japanese government decades later, Courts rejected claims for compensation, citing the immunity granted by post-war agreements. Only fragments remain: testimonies from Chinese survivors, Soviet trial transcripts, scattered documents in US archives, and the physical remains unearthed near Harbin in the 1980s. These fragments paint a picture of systematic, state-sponsored cruelty unmatched in its scope. Yet because the perpetrators were absorbed into the machinery of Cold War intelligence, their crimes never entered the global memory in the same way as Auschwitz or Dachau. They remain half-forgotten, hidden in the footnotes of history books. The story of Unit 731 is not only one of atrocity, it is a story of deliberate erasure, of governments choosing to protect knowledge over justice. The victims were denied recognition, not because their suffering was less than others, but because their killers had something valuable to offer. The shadow of Harbin stretches into laboratories and policies that shaped the post-war world, a reminder that sometimes the victors are not the ones who tell the truth, but the ones who decide which truths will never be told. Today, the remains of Unit 731's complex in Manchuria stand as a museum, reconstructed from ruins. Its walls echo with testimony and exhibits, but the full archive remains scattered, sealed, and contested. The silence imposed by those who bought Ishi's secrets lingers still. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality, that history is not simply what happened, but what was allowed to be remembered. Unit 731 was not forgotten by accident. It was erased, intentionally, strategically, and with the consent of those who claim to stand for justice. Chapter 4: Hidden Massacre at Katyn Forest. In the spring of 1940, in a dense forest near Smolensk, the Soviet secret police carried out an operation designed to eliminate the future of Poland. Under direct orders from Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD, more than 20,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, and professionals, men drawn from the nation's military elite, its universities, and its clergy, were executed with single bullets to the back of the head. Their bodies were dumped into mass graves in the Katyn forest and in other concealed burial sites across Western Russia. The victims were not random prisoners of war. They were Poland's leadership class, men capable of rebuilding the nation once the war ended. By destroying them, Stalin sought to cripple Poland's ability to resist Soviet control. For decades, the massacre remained hidden, buried not only in the soil of Katyn, but in layers of propaganda, denial, and silence. The Germans were the first to uncover the graves. In 1943, after occupying Smolensk, the Wehrmacht announced the discovery of thousands of corpses, their hands bound, their uniforms intact. The Nazi propaganda ministry broadcast the atrocity to the world, accusing the Soviets of mass murder. Yet because it was Berlin making the claim, the Allies dismissed it as fabrication. British intelligence decrypted reports confirming Soviet involvement, but Churchill's war cabinet, anxious to preserve the Grand Alliance, ordered silence. In Washington, the Roosevelt administration faced similar evidence, but chose suppression. The Polish government in exile, operating from London, pressed for investigation. Their protests were ignored, and relations with Moscow deteriorated irreparably. What makes Katyn extraordinary is not only the crime itself, but the decades of denial that followed. At the Nuremberg trials, where the world confronted Nazi war crimes, Katyn was briefly raised as an example of German atrocities. The Soviets insisted the massacre had been committed in 1941, after their retreat from the region, and pressured the tribunal to accept their version. Despite forensic evidence to the contrary, the judges avoided a definitive ruling, unwilling to fracture the fragile Allied unity. In the official record, Katyn remained unresolved, a silence maintained not for lack of truth but for fear of consequences. Declassified documents reveal how far the cover-up extended. In 1952, the US House of Representatives convened the Madden Committee, which concluded unequivocally that the Soviets were responsible. Yet even then, the report was buried in the climate of Cold War diplomacy. Western governments knew the truth, but refused to acknowledge it publicly until decades later. For Poland, the silence was devastating. Families of the victims were forced to live with official lies, told their fathers and brothers had been lost in German custody. To grieve openly was to invite arrest by communist authorities. For 40 years, Katyn was a forbidden word inside Poland, spoken only in whispers, remembered only in exile communities abroad. The NKVD's meticulous documentation, uncovered in fragments after the collapse of the Soviet Union, leaves no doubt about the planning. Signed orders from Beria and approved by Stalin himself detail the executions. The language is chillingly bureaucratic. Requests for ammunition, transport schedules, burial logistics, administrative notes that reduce human lives to lines on a ledger. Executioners worked in shifts, sometimes killing hundreds in a single night. Pistols manufactured in Germany, Walther models supplied to the NKVD, were used deliberately to cast suspicion on the Nazis. Prisoners were marched into forest clearings or transported by truck, then dispatched with mechanical efficiency. The earth swallowed their bodies, layer upon layer, until the ground itself seemed to recoil. When the Soviet Union finally admitted responsibility in 1990, it was not an act of moral reckoning, but of political necessity. Mikhail Gorbachev, seeking to preserve credibility during the final years of the collapsing state, acknowledged the massacre. Even then, access to the full archival record remained restricted. Documents implicating the highest levels of Soviet leadership were released only in part, with many files still classified. The Russian state, even in the post-Soviet era, has struggled to reconcile with Katyn, often retreating into denial or deflection. For Poland, the memory is scar tissue, reopened with each attempt to rewrite or diminish the truth. What remains most disturbing is how the massacre fit into a larger strategy. Katyn was not an isolated crime, but part of a coordinated purge. Other execution sites, Mednoy, Kharkiv, Tver, revealed similar patterns of targeted elimination. Lists of names suggest the NKVD deliberately removed those who might resist Soviet plans for Poland's future. In this sense, Katyn was both massacre and political surgery, designed to paralyze a nation before it could rise again. The silence of the Allies, complicit in their suppression of the truth, ensured that Stalin's objectives succeeded for decades. Poland was left without its leaders, its voice stifled by both occupiers and allies alike. Even today, Katyn resonates not only as a historical tragedy, but as a case study in the manipulation of truth. It demonstrates how facts can be buried beneath alliances, how justice can be postponed indefinitely when inconvenient to power. The families of the murdered officers waited half a century for official recognition, and even now, many questions remain unanswered. Who among the Allies knew the full extent in 1943? Which documents remain hidden in Russian archives? How many other truths, equally damning, lie sealed and waiting? The trees of Katyn have long since grown over the graves. The forest is quiet, a place of mourning marked by memorials erected in recent decades. But silence remains part of its legacy. The silence of governments that chose expedience over justice. The silence of families denied the right to speak. The silence of a world willing to forget. The massacre at Katyn was more than a crime. It was a truth buried alive, a chapter of history deliberately erased, only to claw its way back into the light decades later. The war ended, but its shadows did not. Beneath the photographs of parades and treaties lies a second history. One written in sealed tunnels, secret bargains, erased testimonies, and mass graves concealed beneath forests. These are the truths nations could not afford to tell. The compromises and betrayals hidden behind the illusion of victory. Berlin's tunnels remind us that the Reich's fall was not the end, but the beginning of new rivalries. Operation Keelhaul exposes the cost of diplomacy, measured in human lives sacrificed to fragile alliances. Unit 731 demonstrates how justice was bartered for knowledge, leaving victims forgotten so that powers could sharpen their weapons. Katyn forces us to confront the silence of those who chose political convenience over truth. Each secret reveals a pattern. When survival was at stake, morality was negotiable, and history became something to be managed, not remembered. The files remain incomplete, the redactions thick, the archives silent, and yet fragments keep surfacing, refusing to remain buried. If these 4 secrets escaped the fire, how many more remain hidden, waiting in vaults, waiting in forests, waiting beneath our feet? The war may have ended, but its forbidden echoes still call from the shadows.